Imagine me and you, I do. I think about you day and night. It's only right to think about the girl you love and hold her tight.
Welcome to Crazy Carrot Studios. My name is James, and today we will be going over creating a stamina slider and the class to communicate with it. Alright, back in our project here, we're going to go ahead and first, let's go ahead and create a slider for the stamina. Now we already have a slider here for our health, so let's go over here and go to 2D view, double click on the canvas so that we can get a full view. I'm going to turn the gizmos off, and we're going to retitle this one to be a health slider so we can tell the difference between the two. And then all I'm really going to do is just duplicate this with a Control D, and I am going to just slightly move it up. We'll call this a stamina slider. And let's go ahead and drop this down to the fill area. And instead of green, I'm going to make this one yellow. And then for the background, I don't really want it to be red, so we're just going to make it a nice darker look. Do a little bit of fade, and that way when we do our slider, it's going to look more like this. And let me zoom in a little bit to that. So what I did here, just so you know, on the background, I just made it a darker color, black, or however you want to call it. And then I brought down the alpha just a tad. So it's not a pitch black, it's got more of a faded look. And on the fill, we just changed the color from the original green that we had to a red. I'm going to go and fix this other part, because now that I'm looking at it, I can still see a little bit of that red from it. Let's bring that right there. That'll work. And then for this one here, let's go back to our stamina slider. Let's make sure it looks good full. So it looks like we've got a little bit of that same issue there. I'm just going to bring that out just a tad. Alright, so now we're looking good there. We have a stamina slider and a health slider. So what we need to do now, just like we did with the health, we're going to create a script for our stamina. Now, lots of times you can do this together. You can make an attributes script instead of a health and a stamina and different ones. But just for the practice of getting used to doing this constantly, we're going to create a new C# script. And we're going to call this Stamina Manager, or something like that, whatever you want to call it. Alright, let's go ahead and open this up here once it gets compiled. Any day now, there we go. And just like I always do, I remove everything from the inside so I can start fresh. And I'm going to teach you a little bit something new, just for organizing sake. When you're trying to figure things out and you're trying to learn how to make your own, a good way of figuring it out is actually writing what's called pseudocode, which is basically a few comments that try to let you know what you're exactly going to try to do. So in this particular one, we're trying to get a hold of our stamina manager, and we're trying to reference our stamina slider that we have. So first we need to obviously get a reference to the stamina slider. We're going to probably want it to decrease over time. We're going to want it to, let's say, once it reaches the end. So when stamina reaches, let's say, 0, we want it to recuperate. Or first we want it to stop our sprinting. So we are no longer allowed to sprint. And start regenerating. And then let's go a step further and say, once we get to a certain threshold, we want it to allow us to sprint again. So once we get this here, we kind of get an idea. First, we know we need to get a reference to the slider. So how would we do that? Well, that's typically done through the variables, where we're going to do a serialized field. And we're going to do a private, if I can spell today, slider. And this is going to UI, so make sure you do have the Unity Engine UI up here. And we're going to call this one Stamina Slider. Just like so. So now we have our reference to the Stamina Slider. Now, another thing we're going to want to try to probably have is what our max stamina is and what our current stamina is. Kind of the same way we did with our health. In our health, we had the max and the current and the slider. It's kind of the same thing. So we're going to do another serialized field. And we're going to make these private floats. We'll call this one current stamina. And another one called max stamina. Just like so. Okay, now a couple other things we're going to probably want to add into this that we probably wouldn't have had with our health script is we're going to want to create a couple more floats. Let's call one the depletion rate or something like that. So we're going to do a serialized field. Now, of course, you can hard code these in where you don't have it available to manipulate, but for the most part, you want to be able to tweak these in the inspector. So it's good to have it done as a variable, and we're just going to call this one depletion rate. Why do I do that like that? I do not know. I'm an idiot sometimes. And then we're going to call this one, tell you what, let's define a couple of these. The current stamina is going to equal 100. Oh, we already did that. The max stamina also, we're going to keep that at 100. Now, granted, we're going to be able to change this in the inspector if we want, but just to get at a starting spot. And then depletion, we're going to create it at a 20. So let's 20. For the function, for the float, and a semicolon. And then we want a recoup threshold. So a point of our stamina where it's going to allow us to not sprint or use the sprint button until it gets back to this threshold. And again, this is going to be a serialized field, private float, and we're going to call this recoup. And I'm going to make this, since I want to kind of keep it at a 20%, I'm going to do a 0.2. And again, this can change. If you want your threshold to be at 50% or 80% before you're able to use a sprint, all we would do is change this from a 0.2 to a 0.5 or 0.8 or however you want to do it. But for right now, this is exactly what you're trying to do. Now let's go ahead and put our comments in here just so you can see what we are doing when you come back to this later. So in this particular case, these are the serialized fields that allow the variables to be edited in the inspector. Then we have a reference to the UI slider for the stamina. So we're going to set that right in here. Let's see what else we have here. Sorry, my notes are on my other screen and I got off of it. All right, then we have a maximum amount of stamina that the player can have. We have the current amount of stamina the player has. We have the rate at which our stamina will deplete per second when sprinting. And that's the key thing that you want to realize is this is per second, because we're going to reference it by time. And then this one here is the threshold, of course. It's very good to keep your notes in order like this. Again, I can't stress this enough. When other people are looking at your code and you're trying to, and you're not around for them to, this allows them to know exactly what you're looking for. Plus, it helps you when you come back in and say you haven't worked on it in a little bit. And you come back, all right, what am I doing here? Where is this going? And this kind of helps you understand what you've done to that point. Now, the next thing we're going to want to try to create in here is going to be a reference to the player controller. Now, typically, you're going to do something similar to what we did with the health one, where we're going to do a private, and ours is called the player controller. As you can remember, we did our class on the player controller called playerController. And that's what we're referencing. So we need to make sure this is a private playerController, and we're just going to call it playerController, just so we keep it very clear what we're doing here. And that's basically going to be a reference to the playerController class. And then we're going to create one more thing here in our variables. This is going to be a private bool. And this is going to be a bool that's going to allow us to sprint or not sprint. So we're going to say is sprinting. And we're going to say at the start, it's equal to false. And so again, this is a flag to indicate if the player is currently sprinting. All right. Next, we want to make sure we have a reference to some of these things here in the awake function. So we're going to do our awake function here, which is a private void awake. We would need to get the playerController because obviously right now we're referencing it, but we do not have it because we are not on it. So let's go ahead and go playerController and equals getComponent playerController. Now, just like we were talking about a minute ago, this is going to get the reference to the playerController component that is on the same game object. So again, let me put our code or our comment in there. If you come in here and look into your, let's see, our player, where is my player at? Right there. We have our health script, but we're also going to put on the stamina script that we're creating, the stamina manager. We'll go here as well. I'll add that to it. There we go. There, right underneath it. And so this stamina script needs to access the playerController script right here. So because we're on the same game object, all we have to do is say get component playerController, because everything in here is a component of the player itself. So we can go get component collider, we can get component character controller, but in this particular case, we're getting the component playerController. All right, let's get back into our C# class. And let's get to the next one here. The next thing we want to do in the awake is, we actually have a couple of them. One more second here. In the awake, we want to reference the max stamina and the current stamina to give it the values. So at the start of the game, or before the game actually starts, we're going to say Stamina Slider, and we're going to do dot max value is equal to not the current stamina, but the max stamina. And then stamina slider value is equal to, well, we got to make sure we do value, is equal to current stamina. Now, just like our health, I'm going to come back in here. When we go to our stamina slider, you're going to have the max value, which is going to be what it is all the way at top, which is 1. Well, that 1 is going to equal our max stamina, which is 100. And then our current value, which is our current stamina, is going to be any percentage of that max value. And it's the same thing we did with the health script. When you came in here and looked at the health script that we created, we did basically the same thing. So nothing new here. We're just setting the values of these. So let's go ahead and type in here, setting the max value of the slider to our max stamina value. And same thing with our current stamina. We're just setting the value of the slider to our current stamina value. Excuse me. Okay, so now that we got here, the next thing we're going to do is in the update function. Now in here, there is going to be most of our code that's going to really affect the depletion rates and things like that. But the first thing you want to do is find out, okay, just like we were talking about in our pseudocode, is if the player is sprinting, we want it to deplete our stamina. So the way you're going to do that is if, and you do exclamation point in front of the is sprinting. Now, whenever you do it like this, if you kept it without the exclamation point, that means if the player is sprinting. By putting the exclamation point in front of it, you're saying if the player is not sprinting. So if the player is not sprinting, and we actually want it to be if the player is sprinting in this particular case, we are going to say current stamina minus equals our deplete value, or deplete rate. And we're going to multiply that by time, not delta time. So what this is going to do is, let's go ahead and comment it, subtract the depletion rate if I can spell, from our current stamina. Now the next thing we're going to do is represent this. We're going to have it update the slider at the same time. So our stamina slider dot value is equal to current stamina. So we are now updating, make sure we do the comments first, updating the value of the stamina slider with the value from our current stamina. Like so. Alright, so now there is going to be a next section here where, let's go ahead and put a comment in here. If our player stamina has reached 0 or below, because we are dealing with fractions and this thing is doing it an update, so at some point it will probably go below, but we want to make sure we catch it either way. So let's say if it's 0 or 0, we want it to stop sprinting, which is exactly what we have right here in our pseudocode. We've got it decreasing over time. That was what we did just a minute ago. So now we're hitting the other part, and we're going to say if current stamina is less than or equal to 0, pretty standard math there. We're going to open our brackets and say that we want to stop sprinting. And this is going to be a function that we're going to create. We have not created this yet, so we're going to get an error. Stop sprinting. Okay. Now we've got everything there. Let's go ahead and, just to get that error out of here, I'm going to create a public void stop just like so. That got rid of our error, so we can come back to that in a moment. Now the next thing we want from here is else if the current stamina is greater than our max stamina we're going to say current stamina plus or equals depletion rate times time dot delta time. And we're going to multiply that by the recoup threshold. So basically what we're saying here, so if the player is sprinting, and then the else if is basically saying else, which means if the player is not sprinting, and the current stamina is less than the max stamina, we want to add our depletion rate times that delta time. So before we were subtracting it because you are sprinting, but now that we're not sprinting, we wanted to recoup by that same depletion rate and multiply by times. And we're going to multiply it by the recoup threshold for this. And then after that, we need to update the slider again. So we're going to do stamina slider dot value is equal to the current stamina. So just like this other one here, where you're just updating the stamina slider accordingly. And you typically do this in update because that's going to be updating at every frame, and you want the slider to be accurate with that. But again, you usually want to try to refrain from doing too much into the update, but some things are unavoidable. So let's go ahead and get this in here. And now we also want to create one more method here above the start method. Above the stop, we want to create a start. So public void start sprinting, just like so. Now in this particular one, we're going to make sure we comment out here. Only allow the player to start sprinting if they have enough stamina. Okay, so in order to do it that way, we're going to say if our current stamina is greater than or equal to our max stamina times our recoup threshold. So if that is the case, we're going to say is sprinting is equal to true. So we are setting the sprint flag or bool to true. And then in the next part, we're going to say playerController dot start, which we don't actually have that in there yet. We're going to have to go back in and create a start sprinting. Dang, I cannot spell today. And this particular one, we are calling, got to make sure we use our comments, calling the start sprinting function from the player controller. Okay, so now that we've got that going here, let's go ahead and go to the stop sprinting. So it's going to be pretty much the opposite. So if is sprinting is equal to false, we are setting the flag or bool to be false. And player controller dot stop sprinting. So now we need to go in and create these two functions in our player controller class. This should be pretty much everything we're going to need. We don't need these top three. This should be everything we're going to need to make the stamina work once we create that other part. So we have done all of our pseudocode. We made sure that we have the is sprinting, we're going to subtract the depletion rate. And if it's not sprinting, it's going to increase it back up. And then it's only going to allow us to sprint when our recoup threshold is reached, which is exactly what we wanted to try to accomplish. So let's go ahead and save the script. It's going to throw us some errors until we go ahead and come into our player controller, and let's work on getting that set up to work with this. Okay, so going to our player controller here, if we scroll all the way down, we do have the function for start sprinting already done and a stop sprinting. The problem is it's private, so it's not allowing it to be referenced from another script. This is where we were getting into the public versus private functions. So let's go ahead and change these to public. Okay, and then make this one public. And let's save that. Now when we come over to our stamina class, of course we spelled it right. Geez, I can't spell. That one comes out perfectly the way we want it to. Stop sprinting and to start sprinting. Of course I got semicolon. It's right there. We're all set. Now we've got everything working and no errors. So let's go into Unity and test this out and see if this is actually going to work. So now that we've got it saved, go to our Unity project. Oh, wrong one. There we go. I'm going to take it off our 2D and focus in on the player. Okay, and so let's go to our game view and hit play. All right, so moving right along, we hit speed. We are definitely speeding, but it is not referencing. Well, the reason why, and maybe some of you caught that, we get a null reference. Now that null reference is saying that there is an object reference that is not being attained. And that is pretty simple. If we come down here to our player character and look at our stamina manager, it's missing the slider. Well, it can't really update the slider without it. And because we don't have a null reference blocker on the script, it's throwing a null reference saying, hey, there's something wrong. And if you click on this, it's going to tell you it has to do with the slider right here. And it gives you that little blinking error to show you where that error is coming from. So whenever you have an error and you're not sure what it's coming from, if you just double click on here, it'll bring it to you and you know exactly which line it's being affected. So this line has to do with the stamina slider. So let's go and make sure we add our slider in here. Now when we hit play, we should see that thing go away and not come back up. Exactly the way it is. Now let's hit shift. All right, so that's working, but for some reason it's still not coming off our UI. Let's take a look and see what's going on there. Okay, now let's go ahead and take a look at the script and see why it is not working. And the reason is pretty simple, but I wanted to make sure I placed it in here so you can see how to debug and figure things out. So in our update, we're going to first check and see, is it referencing this printing? So I'm going to do a debug.log. And this is just a simple way of debugging and seeing if something's working. And we're going to use our is printing bool to find out if it's registering a sprint or not. And then we're going to put a semicolon behind it. Now let's go ahead and save this real quick and take a look. And go to our project here once it gets finished compiling. And you'll notice when we first hit play, it's going to say is printing is equal to false. And that's mainly because in the beginning, we tell it to say it's false from the start. But it's never going to show us it going to true, even when you hit the shift key. And I'll explain that in just a second. So when you hit shift, it's running, but it's never registering as true. So let's see what we can do to fix that. And it's a simple fix. If you look at it thoroughly, and I kind of did this on purpose, even though this is technically the wrong way to probably do this, but I wanted to make sure you understand how to debug. So really and truly, we don't need our private bool in here because if you look at it, we have a private bool here. Our public bool here that's printing. It was private. We need to change it to public. That's going to be false. And then when it comes down here to the start and stop, it's changing the bool correctly here. Now, a couple things we could do is we could reference the bool from here and from the stamina manager and add that in here as well, but that's overkill. So the best thing to really do in this particular case, since we've already written it all out, rather than rewriting it into the player controller, is to reference the player controller's bool instead of this one. So what we're going to do is we're going to completely take this one completely out. So I'm just commenting it out. And then when we see these little little lines here, we're going to replace that with our player controller, because we are referencing the player controller right here. So we're going to reference player controller, and we're going to hit dot, And then if you look in the player controller, as long as we made this public here, this sprinting bool public, we should be able to reference it right here. So when we come to the dot, we do the underline, you see the sprinting bool correctly right there. So we're going to change it there, and we're going to change it here, and we're going to change it here. So now the bool is never being controlled in our stamina manager. It's being controlled from the player controller. And that way, whenever we hit the shift key, it's going to automatically switch it to true. And when we let go of the shift key, it's going to automatically shift it to false. So let's save all that, and let's go back in and see how that works out. So let's hit play. Now we start to sprint. We should see the stamina bar go down. And sure enough, I don't even have to go forward. If I'm holding the shift key, it's coming down. So it's being triggered by just the shift. Now, if I get to the very end, it's going to stop me from sprinting. You see how it slowed me down, and it starts recuperating. Now, once it gets to that, I can hit shift again. Again, it'll take me until it stops. But it's going to slowly regenerate all the way to the top while walking. But once you hit shift again, it's going to only do it from that side, which is ideally what we wanted to do. So now we not only have the sprinting working with a thing, we also have our health working for both regenerating and damaging. And so we've got a more complete functional UI and character controller going on here. So in our next tutorial, we'll try to create a basic pause menu to continue this forward. And from all of us at Crazy Carrot Studios, we would like to say thank you. And don't forget to please like and subscribe. We will see you next time when we get back to Learning with Bob.
The sky